The crossing itself had been an ordeal of a different sort. Liberty ships and hastily converted transports carried human cargo westward across grey Atlantic swells. Down in the holds, packed shoulder to shoulder, the men rode out the journey in states ranging from resignation to terror. One corporal would remember decades later how they'd convinced themselves that torture awaited, that the Americans would shave their heads and lock them in underground dungeons. Death at sea started seeming like mercy compared to what their imaginations conjured. The propaganda they'd absorbed hadn't been subtle. America was painted as a land of gangsters and racial chaos, where captured soldiers would face mob violence and systematic abuse. Every sound in those ship holds took on sinister meaning. Metal groaned. Water slapped against hulls. Alert sirens occasionally shrieked when sonar detected possible submarine threats, sending hearts racing. The smell of oil and sweat and seasickness became inescapable. One man recalled thinking every creak of the vessel's frame announced a torpedo strike, but the U-boats stalking those shipping lanes never found their convoy. Destroyer escorts kept watch, and the grey armada pushed steadily west toward ports along the American eastern seaboard. Newport News, Norfolk, Boston. These names meant nothing to most of the prisoners until they found themselves disembarking onto docks where military police directed them with efficiency rather than cruelty. The shouted commands were firm but not vicious. Nobody struck them. Nobody spat. They were herded toward waiting trains with an almost bureaucratic detachment that confused men expecting far worse. The journey continued inland, steam locomotives hauling them deeper into a country that revealed itself through windows as fundamentally different from anything they'd known. Green fields rolled past, untouched by war. Farmhouses stood intact, clotheslines hung with washing flapping in the breeze. Cattle grazed peacefully. Fences marked property boundaries that nobody had blown apart. For soldiers accustomed to landscapes scarred by artillery, to villages reduced to rubble, to populations traumatized and scattered, the sight proved deeply unsettling. One private managed to scribble observations in a notebook he'd hidden. The normalcy seemed impossible when set against the destruction consuming Europe. Women hung laundry without fear, children played. How could this nation claim to be fighting the same war that had turned German cities into ash fields? That contradiction struck them before they ever saw the inside of a camp. The land itself contradicted everything they'd been taught. America was supposed to be collapsing under internal conflicts, weakened by its mongrel population and degenerate culture. Instead, they saw prosperity and peace, an economy humming along while feeding a war machine across 2 oceans. The cognitive dissonance started there, on those train rides through the American interior. Texas prairies stretched enormous under big skies when they finally reached their destinations. Cicadas droned in the heat. Dust devils spun across empty spaces. The trains disgorged their cargo at camp gates where barbed wire gleamed and guard towers stood sentinel. But even here, details contradicted expectations. The barracks had windows with actual glass. Canteens were being set up to distribute food. Outside, prisoners could see men marking out boundaries for soccer fields. This wasn't the dungeon of Nazi propaganda. It looked more like a Spartan military village. Guards addressed them in matter-of-fact tones, delivering instructions without malice. Line formations, blanket distribution, uniform assignments. Everything proceeded according to protocols that seemed designed more for management than punishment. A sergeant muttered to his companions that calling this place a prison felt wrong. It resembled a self-contained settlement more than a cage. What the captives were beginning to discover, though few understood it fully yet, was that their treatment would follow rules established by international agreement. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had laid out specific protections for prisoners of war, and the United States had both signed that treaty and possessed the resources to honour it. Most of these draftees had never heard of such conventions. They'd been raised in a system where might made right and weakness invited destruction. The idea that warfare could be bound by mutually agreed limitations seemed almost naive, yet the numbers told their own story. By late 1943, approaching 300,000 Axis prisoners were already in American custody on home soil. That figure would climb past 370,000 before the war concluded. Camps spread across the landscape from California deserts to New England forests, but the heartland absorbed the largest concentrations. Texas, Nebraska, Iowa, Oklahoma. These agricultural states with enormous empty spaces became home to sprawling detention facilities. The initial shock those first prisoners experienced never entirely faded. Letters written months later still expressed disbelief. They'd expected treatment as animals and instead found themselves treated as human beings subject to military discipline. But arrival marked only the beginning of a longer journey. The fingerprinting, documentation, uniform distribution, the steady rhythm of camp routines, all of this would gradually reveal just how different their war would be on American soil compared to the nightmares their countrymen endured in Soviet camps or the harsh conditions American prisoners faced in German or Japanese hands. Processing centers became the first real introduction to American military bureaucracy. Facilities at forts scattered across Virginia, New Jersey, Louisiana, these became the initial waypoints where confused men were systematically catalogued. The sounds defined the experience as much as anything else. Typewriter keys clacking constantly, ink rollers clicking as fingerprints were taken, cameras snapping identification photographs. Each prisoner received a number, got logged into extensive records, was issued rough denim work clothes stenciled with large black letters spelling out PW across chest and back. The paradoxes multiplied immediately. Instead of being stripped and humiliated, they received shoes that fit, socks, even razors for shaving. One prisoner's testimony captured the surreal quality. In the North African desert, they'd lived in conditions barely above animal subsistence, beards growing wild, uniforms rotting off their bodies. Now, in captivity, they could shave daily and maintain an appearance of military bearing. The irony cut deep. Imprisonment was granting them dignity that their own collapsing army no longer could provide. American procedures weren't improvised reactions. The 1929 Convention provided detailed frameworks guaranteeing that prisoners of war would receive rations equivalent to those given American troops, would have access to medical treatment, would be sheltered from violence, and could even send and receive mail under censorship. In practice, every rule didn't get perfectly observed at every camp at every moment, but the overall framework shocked men who'd been promised they'd face starvation and beatings. Oversight came from the Provost Marshal General's Office, a specialized army branch tasked with managing hundreds of thousands of captives across dozens of states. Camps followed standardized layouts resembling small military installations. Barracks stood in orderly rows. Mess halls served communal meals. Canteens offered small luxuries. Recreation areas got designated. German officers typically were separated from enlisted ranks, a policy meant to reduce the influence of hardcore believers and maintain smoother order. Certain prisoners got selected for special attention. At Fort Hunt in Virginia, operating under the cryptic address Post Office Box 1142, selected captives with technical knowledge found themselves subject to intelligence interrogation. U-boat officers, scientists, high-ranking staff officers, anyone with potentially valuable information might end up there. The questioning was intensive, but, survivors noted, lacked the brutality they'd anticipated. Tea, cigarettes, patient questioning. One naval engineer recalled decades later that the psychological approach proved more effective and more unnerving than any physical coercion could have been. Most prisoners never saw Fort Hunt, though. The majority got shipped to sprawling compounds designed to hold thousands, facilities ringed with wire and overlooked by guard towers, but organized internally like self-contained communities. Those nighttime train rides deeper into America's interior gave them endless opportunities to stare out narrow windows at a landscape that seemed untouched by global conflict. cornfields extending to horizons, towns that kept their streetlights burning after dark, while German cities smothered every light source under blackout curtains. The contrast hammered home just how differently this war was touching different continents. By early 1944, nearly 350 camps operated across 46 states. Some held just a few hundred prisoners. Others, massive facilities like Camp Hearn in Texas or Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, housed more than 4,000 men each. The logistical burden was staggering. Moving that many people, feeding them, clothing them, maintaining order, processing their mail, arranging their labor details, it all required extensive bureaucratic machinery. But that machinery functioned with surprising efficiency. Within days of arrival at their assigned camps, prisoners discovered daily routines that mirrored regular military life minus the combat. Dawn roll calls, meals in mess halls at scheduled times, work assignments for maintaining the camp infrastructure. The similarity to garrison duty was intentional. Structure reduced tension and kept men occupied. Complaints could be filed through proper channels, and sometimes those complaints actually received responses. One man laughed years later, remembering how they'd petitioned about bread being too soft, lacking the crusty texture they preferred. A week later, the bread came out crustier. That the authorities had actually listened to such a minor complaint astonished them. The contrast with how Germany treated its prisoners was something many became increasingly aware of through letters smuggled or officially received from home. Stories filtered through about Soviet prisoners dying by the tens of thousands in German camps, about brutal treatment of American and British captives in certain facilities. Now they sat in wooden barracks warmed by pot-bellied stoves in winter, reasonably fed, allowed to write home, even permitted religious services on Sundays. Some felt shame gnawing alongside the homesickness. Suspicion persisted despite mounting evidence that the treatment would remain consistent. Whispers circulated that this leniency represented a trick, that cruelty would eventually emerge once guards tired of pretending. But weeks became months. The routine held steady. Uniforms got replaced when worn. Rations remained adequate. Religious observances continued. Medical care was provided when men fell ill. Slowly, disbelief calcified into a kind of reluctant trust. What came next would test that trust in unexpected ways. By winter of 1943, rumours began circulating through the barbed wire compounds about prisoners being allowed outside. Most dismissed this as impossible fantasy. In Germany, captured enemies were caged like dangerous animals. The idea of walking among civilian populations seemed absurd. Yet on a frosty morning in Texas, gates actually clanged open. Squads of German prisoners filed out under loose guard supervision. No chains rattled on wrists or ankles. Boots hit gravel freely. The paradox manifested immediately and undeniably. Here they were, enemy soldiers in uniform despite the PW markings, walking through American towns as though they were merely labourers on supervised work details. Guards maintained respectful distances. Rifles hung from shoulders casually, muzzles pointed down. To the prisoners' amazement, townspeople barely seemed to notice them. Farmers removing hats in greeting as they passed. Shopkeepers pausing in doorways to watch but not to threaten. A Bavarian conscript's diary entry captured the surreal quality. They'd expected to be bound and paraded for humiliation, but instead they strolled while children licked candy canes, and one small girl even waved at them. It felt like emerging from a nightmare into an entirely different existence. The sensory assault overwhelmed carefully maintained mental defences. Bacon smells from diners. Glenn Miller's music spilling from drugstore radios. Newspapers slapping pavement as delivery boys shouted headlines about distant battles. In Germany, city streets smelled of dust, smoke, and fear. Here, everything was coffee and gasoline and normalcy. At first, prisoners kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Would they be paraded for public ridicule? But no jeering crowds materialized. No organized humiliation occurred. One man testified to the strange power of trust. Guards walked behind prisoners rather than in front, weapons held ready but not threatening. Nobody was chained because the authorities apparently trusted them not to flee. And strangely, mysteriously, almost all of them didn't flee. Trust became a more effective restraint than iron ever could be. Escape remained theoretically possible. Fields stretched for uncountable miles. Some prisoners did attempt it, but most stayed put. Where would they go? America's vastness made successful escape nearly impossible. The population was too alert, too ready to report strangers. And the guards, for all their seeming casualness, still represented real authority backed by real consequences. The freedom was symbolic rather than absolute, but for men conditioned by totalitarian systems to expect nothing but brutality from enemies, it proved staggering. Statistics from 1944 reveal how common these supervised town visits became. Tens of thousands of POWs regularly left their camps under escort to perform labor or occasionally shop at approved establishments. Camp administrators tracking escape attempts found rates consistently below 1%, far lower than anyone had predicted. The absence of chains worked as effectively as any physical restraint could have. Some local Americans remembered these strange processions vividly for decades afterward. A Nebraska farmer's son recounted watching enemy soldiers walk past the family barn like neighbors heading to work. The kids followed out of curiosity. The prisoners didn't look dangerous or monstrous. They looked tired and human. The ordinariness of it stuck in memory precisely because it contradicted every propaganda image of savage enemies. The paradox grew sharper as prisoners compared reality against what they'd been taught. Regime propaganda had painted Americans as brutal, decadent, racially chaotic monsters barely held together by Jewish manipulation and capitalist greed. Now they walked past intact schools, saw families shopping without fear, breathed air free from the terror that had gripped Europe. One officer muttered bitterly that if people back in Berlin truly understood these conditions, morale would collapse overnight and the war would end. Not every interaction was friendly. Some townsfolk spat or deliberately turned away. Veterans' organizations organized protests demanding stricter treatment of enemy prisoners. Letters to newspaper editors questioned why captured Germans enjoyed comforts while American boys bled in European mud. But overall, the system functioned smoothly. It worked because the spectacle of freedom under watchful supervision proved more psychologically effective than punishment. Every step down an American main street, every smell of cigarette smoke drifting from a corner store, every glance at shop windows displaying goods unavailable in Europe, all of it chipped away at worldviews forged under dictatorship. The escort walks became routine, yet remained revelatory. Men were still prisoners, that fact never changed. But the absence of chains, the trust implied by that absence, communicated messages about America that no propaganda leaflet dropped from bombers could have conveyed. What they encountered next would bind them even more tightly to this paradox of captivity without cruelty. If supervised walks into town had unsettled the prisoners, the work program that followed reshaped many of them completely. America didn't keep its captives idle behind wire. By 1944, the War Manpower Commission was coordinating extensively with military authorities to channel POW labor directly into the American economy. Fields needed harvesting across the agricultural heartland. Timber needed cutting in forests. Factories needed hands on production lines. With millions of American men serving overseas, labor shortages threatened to cripple essential industries. Prisoners could fill those gaps. The paradox intensified. Men who'd recently fought to destroy the United States now bent their backs to feed it and fuel its war machine. In Texas, cotton fields stretched endlessly, the smell of damp earth clinging to clothes and skin. Nebraska and Iowa sent prisoners into sugar beet fields, where they swung hoes until muscles screamed. Wisconsin detailed them to dense forests, where the rasp of saws and the scent of fresh-cut pine filled their days. The work was genuinely hard, nobody pretended otherwise. But it wasn't slavery. Prisoners received payment, not cash they could pocket, but credits in camp scrip redeemable at canteens. Chocolate bars became achievable luxuries. Shaving soap, cigarettes, writing paper, all the small comforts that made imprisonment bearable could be earned through labour. One prisoner calculated years later that he'd earned more cutting sugar beets in Iowa than he'd been paid as a soldier fighting in North Africa. The absurdity of that struck him even at the time, but the truth remained undeniable. Numbers convey the massive scale of this labour programme. By late 1945, more than 425,000 POW labourers in America had performed over 45 million man-days of agricultural work. In certain counties, German prisoners harvested as much as a third of all local crops. Economists studying the period concluded that without POW labour, entire regional harvests would have rotted unharvested in the fields. The programme proved essential to maintaining agricultural production during the war's critical final years. For many farmers, initial suspicion and resentment gradually gave way to appreciation. "They saved our farm," one Iowa woman wrote in a letter preserved in archives. "Without those workers, the corn would have died unharvested and we'd have faced financial ruin." Farmers frequently shared lunches with their temporary workers. Sandwiches, thermoses of lemonade, sometimes even homemade pie appeared. The Germans tasted white bread, rich with real butter, sweet jams, meat sandwiches, unlike anything still available in their increasingly desperate homeland. The irony was sharp and inescapable. Their captors fed them better than their own military had managed in years. Sensory contrasts seared themselves into memories that lasted lifetimes. A private from Hesse remembered tasting an orange for the first time during a work break. Fruit had vanished from Germany by 1942, rationed away to nothing. Biting into that orange felt like tasting concentrated sunshine. Others recalled the smell of fresh coffee brewed in thermoses farmers carried to the fields, stronger and richer than the ersatz substitutes they'd choked down back home. Mistrust persisted in certain quarters. Some American families glared as enemy soldiers trudged past their properties, resentful that men who'd tried to kill their sons now worked their soil and ate their food. Veterans organizations protested loudly, accusing Washington of coddling enemies who deserved harsher treatment. Yet practical necessity overrode ideology for most people. The labor was too desperately needed to reject on principle, and the regulations were too strict to allow real danger. Guards remained present at work sites, rifles always at the ready, even if rarely raised in threat. The POWs themselves noticed another paradox embedded in the work programme. They enjoyed a kind of freedom of movement within captivity. Working in open fields, they could see sky unobstructed to the horizon, could smell the turning seasons, could hear locusts buzzing and cornstalks rustling in wind. Some could theoretically have run. Few actually did. Where would escape lead except to starvation or quick recapture? Work meant regular food, modest pay, and time spent outside the wire. For men imprisoned far from home, those small benefits outweighed the risk of futile flight. Memoirs written decades later frequently testified that labour changed prisoners more profoundly than any ideological re-education lectures could have. One man wrote that working American fields taught him the source of the nation's strength wasn't its weapons, but its incredible agricultural abundance. Even the soil seemed richer than European ground. They fed us from surpluses we literally couldn't imagine existing while our families starved on rations. When each day's labour ended, prisoners returned under escort not to dungeons or starvation rations, but to barracks with hot meals waiting, to letters from home that somehow made it through censorship and across submarine-infested oceans, to radios sometimes crackling with the same Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman tunes they'd heard in town. The work was just one part of a larger revelation, though. Beyond the agricultural labour lay an even greater shock: direct exposure to American culture that opened libraries, churches and music halls to men who'd sworn oaths to destroy everything those institutions represented. The labour kept hands and bodies occupied, but what truly lodged in prisoners' minds were the cultural glimpses they absorbed during those supervised outings and through programmes within the camps themselves. Every trip into town felt like stepping through a portal into an alternate reality. The Reich's propaganda had painted America as degenerate, violent, tearing itself apart under the weight of racial chaos and moral decay. Yet Main Street America told a completely different story through neon signs, bustling cafes, children on bicycles riding under safe skies. The paradox struck deeply. Here they were, uniformed prisoners marked clearly with PW letters, yet they tasted a kind of freedom their own families in Germany hadn't known in years. One private remembered people looking at them with curiosity rather than hatred, and that absence of expected hostility proved more shocking than any confrontation would have been. The sensory palate dazzled men accustomed to wartime deprivation. Radios in shop windows played American swing music that propaganda had condemned as racially impure and culturally degenerate, yet the melodies proved undeniably infectious. The smell of buttered popcorn drifted from movie theatres advertising films with titles like Casablanca and Yankee Doodle Dandy. Grocery store displays gleamed with canned fruit, chocolate bars, coffee tins stacked ceiling high. These were luxuries completely absent from Europe since 1940 or earlier. The sheer abundance seemed almost obscene, set against memories of strict rationing and increasing hunger back home. Inside the camps, American authorities actively encouraged cultural engagement rather than suppressing it. Many compounds maintained libraries stocked with books in both English and German. Classrooms were established for language study. Orchestras formed from musically trained prisoners. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, German musicians performed Mozart and Beethoven on instruments loaned by local residents, their concerts drawing audiences of fellow prisoners and sometimes even guards and townspeople. Camp Hearn in Texas saw prisoners staging theatrical productions complete with costumes sewn from scraps and backdrops painted with whatever materials could be scavenged. Sports flourished throughout the camp system. Soccer matches drew hundreds of spectators within the wire, men cheering their comrades with the same passion they'd shown before the war interrupted normal life. Baseball, that quintessentially American game, became a curious new passion. At first we laughed at this strange sport, one POW confessed in a letter home. By summer we were swinging bats with enthusiasm and arguing over rules we barely understood. The crack of wood on leather, the smell of dust rising from makeshift base plates, these became embedded in camp memories alongside darker recollections of capture and displacement. Religious observance played its role too. Chaplains, both German-speaking and American, conducted Sunday services in spaces designated as temporary chapels. Hymns echoed across compounds, voices rising in German and sometimes in halting English. For men displaced thousands of miles from home, religious continuity provided a tether to identity and dignity. Letters prisoners wrote home, those that survived censorship intact, testified to their astonishment. One soldier wrote to parents in Bavaria describing how they'd been given opportunities to read, to study, even to perform music. He'd expected captivity to mean chains and darkness. Instead, it felt like living in a peculiar kind of school where everyone wore the same uniform and nobody could leave, but education and culture continued. By 1945, statistics reveal the impressive scale of this cultural program. The US Army had distributed more than 1 million books to POW camps nationwide. Over 2,000 educational courses had been organized. Tens of thousands of men would leave America speaking significantly better English than they'd possessed upon arrival. Some left with more education than they'd received before being drafted into military service. Skepticism about these programs existed among American civilians. Not everyone welcomed the idea of providing enemy soldiers with libraries, musical instruments, and language education. Newspaper editorials questioned why Germans could watch movies while American boys bled in European foxholes. But military authorities defended the policy on multiple grounds. The Geneva Convention established certain standards. Beyond legal obligations, though, lay a pragmatic belief that humane treatment encouraged cooperation and reduced security problems. The paradox operated powerfully on psychological levels. Every song heard on a camp radio, every novel checked out from a library, every baseball game played on a dusty field chipped away at the totalitarian worldview these men had absorbed. It wasn't propaganda leaflets that shifted hearts and minds. It was the quiet, ordinary texture of daily life, the accumulation of small normalcies that contradicted everything they'd been taught about their enemies. Yet tension simmered beneath the surface civility. Not every American smiled at the sight of uniformed Germans walking their streets or working their fields. Mothers who'd received telegrams about sons killed in action clenched fists when prison trucks rolled past. Black Americans observing white enemy soldiers receiving dignities denied to them whispered bitterly about freedoms distributed by race rather than humanity. The cultural exchange was real and often positive, but it exposed contradictions too. What prisoners encountered in their daily interactions with American civilians revealed even more about a nation wrestling with its own contradictions while fighting a total war across 2 oceans and multiple continents. German prisoners might have marveled at American abundance and cultural openness, but Americans themselves were profoundly divided about the sight of enemy soldiers on home soil. Reactions varied as widely as the nation's geography. On one hand, farmers, mill operators, and factory managers came to depend heavily on POW labour. They saw young men who worked hard rather than monsters from propaganda posters. After sweating through long days in fields or forests, many employers offered basic kindnesses: sandwiches, cold drinks, occasionally even slices of homemade pie. Gestures that would have been unthinkable under the hate-soaked rhetoric defining the war effort. They worked as hard as any man I'd hired, one Iowa farmer's wife recalled years later. Eventually, we pitied them more than we hated them. They were boys far from home, caught up in something beyond their control. But for other Americans, every glimpse of enemy uniforms cut like a knife. Mothers whose sons lay in military cemeteries overseas clenched their jaws watching prisoner trucks roll through town at dusk. Veterans in small communities sometimes spat as POWs marched past under guard. Why should they eat meat and fresh bread while our boys choke down field rations? One angry letter to a newspaper editor demanded to know. The paradox proved especially sharp and bitter in the American South. In states like Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas, black citizens noticed with crystal clarity that German prisoners, white men who'd sworn oaths to a leader who preached racial supremacy, were allowed to eat in restaurants that barred African Americans from entry. In documented cases, prisoners sat down to full meals in establishments where black citizens could only work as kitchen staff, never as customers. One black veteran wrote decades later about fighting for freedom overseas, only to return home and discover that German POWs enjoyed more of it than he did in his own country. This racial contradiction wasn't lost on the Germans themselves. Some recorded in diaries and letters their confusion witnessing a nation that gave them libraries, music, and decent food, while systematically denying basic rights to a significant portion of its own population. For many prisoners, this hypocrisy became their most lasting and troubling impression of America. The cognitive dissonance of it stuck with them. Still, individual acts of kindness persisted throughout the system. School children sometimes waved as prisoner work details marched past. In rare moments, families left baskets of fruit at roadsides for guards to distribute. At Christmas, church groups sent packages of candy, cigarettes, and warm socks into camps. One prisoner described opening a package labelled simply from a friend and feeling overwhelmed by the gesture from an unknown American. Suspicion and fear naturally remained in many communities. Rumours spread about potential sabotage, about prisoners poisoning water supplies or planning coordinated uprisings. Guards kept weapons ready, even if they rarely needed to raise them in actual threat. In some locations, small protests erupted demanding harsher treatment, stricter confinement, reduced rations. Signs appeared in store windows: No German trade. Yet actual violence remained remarkably rare considering the circumstances. America had chosen, whether consciously or through the accumulation of policy decisions, to fight its captured enemies with abundance rather than starvation, with law rather than revenge. Statistics tell a quiet but compelling story about this choice. By 1945, fewer than 1% of POWs in American custody had attempted escape, and nearly all of those were recaptured quickly. Why risk running when the territory beyond the fences seemed less like enemy ground and more like a confusing landscape of unexpected generosity mixed with visible inequality? The paradox deepened the longer camps operated. America prosecuted the war with devastating ruthlessness overseas, incinerating cities in both Germany and Japan, yet within its own borders extended to enemy soldiers a degree of humanity that astonished those who experienced it. That contradiction, ferocity abroad and relative civility at home, embedded itself in the memories of the captured. This peculiar treatment set conditions for what would follow after the shooting stopped. When the war finally ended and camp gates swung open for repatriation, many Germans would carry back to a devastated Europe not just memories of hard labour, but complex recollections of America's cultural contradictions, its generosity, and its failures. The paradox of freedom within captivity got preserved not only in fading memories, but in permanent written records. Every German prisoner enjoyed the right under Geneva Convention rules to write letters home. 2 per month, censored but real. Those letters, hundreds of thousands of them, carried astonishment across submarine-infested Atlantic waters. Dear Lotta, one prisoner scrawled in late 1944, "Guards march us to town without chains or ropes. There are shops selling goods we haven't seen in years. Cars drive past. Music plays. I struggle to understand any of it." His words were trimmed by the censor's pencil, but shock still leaked through legible sentences. Camp newsletters, often edited by prisoners themselves under American supervision, became another channel for testimony. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, Germans published a periodical they titled Der Zaungast, the Fence Guest. Mimeographed pages contained poems, personal essays, even small illustrations. Some pieces praised American treatment. Others wrestled with shame over defeat and confusion about the future. To guards and officers who approved its printing, the newsletter seemed harmless. To historians examining it generations later, it provided invaluable windows into prisoners' conflicted mental states. Oral histories recorded decades after the war reveal even sharper expressions of astonishment. A former Africa Corps officer interviewed in 1983 recalled how they'd marched through American towns with rifle barrels pointed down rather than at them. He'd assumed it was a trick initially. In Germany, prisoners got chained like criminals. In America, prisoners walked with relative freedom. The contrast defied comprehension. Memoirs confirm the sensory strangeness of that paradoxical freedom. The clatter of plates in diners, the smell of gasoline on wide paved streets, the taste of Coca-Cola, sweet and fizzy and unlike anything available in wartime Europe. For men who'd marched through North African deserts or across frozen Eastern European steppes, the simple pleasure of a cold soda in a camp canteen became an unforgettable luxury worth describing in detail. Statistics confirm how extensively this recorded testimony spread. By 1945, more than 350,000 letters monthly were dispatched from POW camps across America to Germany, Switzerland, or Red Cross relay stations for forwarding. Even through military censorship, messages got through. Their sons weren't starving. Chains didn't bind them. Was the Reich's promise of racial and cultural superiority just elaborate lies? Such dangerous questions began circulating among families receiving these confusing reports from across the ocean. For Americans reading intercepted correspondence or listening years later to memoirs, the impact proved equally sharp. They realized their ordinary civilian acts, offering sandwiches, allowing supervised town walks, lending musical instruments, had become effective weapons in an ideological struggle. Not propaganda in the traditional sense, but lived reality that contradicted totalitarian narratives more effectively than any poster or radio broadcast could manage. As the war's conclusion drew nearer, these preserved voices grew louder and more numerous. Camps organized choirs that performed for visitors. Art exhibits displayed paintings and sketches created during idle hours. English language classes graduated students who could converse with guards. The cultural records produced blurred traditional lines between captors and captives, creating archives that would complicate simplistic narratives about World War II for generations. Those voices captured in letters, newsletters, oral histories, and memoirs ensured that what happened during those unchained walks through American small towns and those long days in agricultural fields wouldn't vanish when camps finally closed. But the greatest test for these memories came with repatriation. Would recollections of American abundance and contradictory freedoms survive the voyage back to a shattered homeland? Or would they dissolve in the ruins of a Germany devastated by total defeat? Guns fell silent across Europe in May 1945, but for prisoners scattered across America, the war didn't conclude instantly. Trains continued rumbling across the continent, carrying men to Iowa harvests, Texas cotton fields, northwestern logging operations. Repatriation represented a massive logistical puzzle. Nearly 425,000 German POWs had to be transported home in carefully managed waves. Many went first to Britain or France for additional labour duty before finally reaching German soil. For substantial numbers, leaving America proved harder emotionally than arriving had been. Memoir after memoir, interview after interview, men confessed they dreaded departure. One prisoner at Camp Algona admitted wishing the transport train would never arrive. Here he had bread daily, could listen to music, maintained dignity. At home there would only be rubble, starvation, chaos. Another recalled stepping off a ship at Bremerhaven in 1946 and experiencing profound shock at the hunger visible in every face, the cold penetrating every building, the gaunt desperation of civilians who'd survived the war's final catastrophic year. The legacy of those unchained walks and shared meals and baseball games rippled outward in unexpected patterns. Some returnees arrived in Germany determined to help rebuild society using models they'd glimpsed in America. Democratic debate, open markets, even small things like community baseball leagues. Others carried darker memories focused on racial contradictions that revealed American hypocrisy. They gave us freedom while in chains, one man wrote bitterly, yet denied it absolutely to their own citizens based solely on skin colour. Yet stories of kindness multiplied across the years. Farmers who'd employed POW labour received letters from Germany well into the 1950s and beyond. Thanks for a sandwich shared during lunch break. Gratitude for a friendly word when homesickness became overwhelming. Appreciation for a small Christmas gift that made captivity bearable. Some former prisoners actually returned after rebuilding their lives, immigrating to the very nation that had once held them captive. By the 1950s, veterans of both sides occasionally encountered each other again, not as enemies across barbed wire, but as neighbours in the same communities. Statistically, the entire experiment had proven astonishingly stable. Fewer than 3,000 escape attempts occurred across the entire duration of the program, and nearly all failed quickly. Violence between prisoners and guards remained extremely rare. What endured instead in collective memory was an image of a nation powerful enough to wage war ruthlessly across continents, yet confident enough to treat captured enemies with unexpected decency. The paradox came full circle in the end. German soldiers had crossed the Atlantic expecting chains, systematic cruelty, deliberate starvation. What they found instead was pie on farmhouse tables, jukeboxes playing swing music, towns that let them walk under watchful but not hostile eyes. They'd arrived as defeated soldiers. Many left having received an education about democracy and abundance that no classroom could have provided. In a very real sense, America's greatest weapon against totalitarian ideology wasn't its bombs or tanks or navies, but its surplus, its confidence, its willingness to demonstrate rather than merely proclaim its values. The paradox of treating enemies humanely while waging total war elsewhere proved more effective than anyone initially calculated. Those prisoners who returned to help rebuild Germany, who remembered American abundance and contradictions, who compared systems they'd experienced directly, became quiet agents of cultural change in the post-war era. Not all drew the same conclusions, certainly, but enough carried memories that challenged authoritarian thinking to make a difference in the long rebuilding that followed total defeat. The story of German POWs in America during World War II stands as a peculiar chapter in military history, one that reveals as much about American society and its contradictions as it does about the experiences of the imprisoned. The hundreds of thousands who passed through that system, who worked those fields and walked those streets and ate those meals, represented an unintended experiment in what happens when ideology confronts lived reality. For many, the contrast proved unforgettable and transformative. They'd been raised to believe in racial hierarchies and authoritarian certainties. America showed them, through mundane daily interactions rather than grand statements, that other possibilities existed. The lessons weren't always comfortable or entirely positive, given the racial inequalities those prisoners witnessed. But the overall impact of experiencing relative freedom and abundance while technically imprisoned created cognitive shifts that propaganda alone could never have achieved. Decades later, when elderly men were asked what they remembered most clearly from the war, many didn't cite battles or comrades lost. Instead, they recalled the smell of fresh coffee on an American farm, the taste of an orange, the sound of children waving without hatred, the feeling of walking through a town without chains. Those small moments, paradoxical and strange, became the memories that endured longest and shaped understanding most profoundly. The war ended. The prisoners went home. But what they carried with them, in memories and letters and stories told to children and grandchildren, ensured that this strange chapter of American history would continue generating reflection and debate for generations to come.